Hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Weiss, and I'm the Manager of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Donald Kuspit, Art is a Guarantee of Sanity, the James L. Weinberg Distinguished Lecture. This talk is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Louise Bourgeois, Freud's Daughter, on view through September 12, 2021, and we encourage you to visit if you are able to do so. The James L. Weinberg Distinguished Lecture is made possible by the Marshall M. Weinberg Fund, with additional support from Marshall M. Weinberg, and we are thankful for their support of the museum's programming. Now I would like to briefly introduce our speaker. Donald Kuspit is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Art History and Philosophy at Stony Brook University and former A.D. White Professor at Large at Cornell University. He has received numerous awards and fellowships, including the Frank Jewett Mather Award for Distinction in Art Criticism by the CAA, and a citation for Distinguished Service to the Visual Arts from the National Association of Schools of Art and Design. He has written numerous books, articles, reviews, and catalog essays. It is my pleasure to welcome him to begin this talk.
Hi, my name is Donald Kuspit. I'm going to be talking about Louise Bourgeois. My title of my talk is The Benefit of Art According to Louise Bourgeois. Art is a guarantee of sanity. That's her own statement. So here is my talk. The issue of Louise Bourgeois' art is whether art did indeed secure her sanity, or at least assure her that she was sane, at least while making art, rather than, as I will argue, offer her respite from her insanity, which, as she realized, was incurable, but could be managed or kept under control by being converted into or exorcised in art. Just as Picasso said his grotesque Demoiselles d'Avignon 1907 work was an exorcism, and with that an attack on the prostitutes who gave him gonorrhea, so Bourgeois' bizarre dolls, many agonized self-portraits, as in Rejection, a work from 2001, others showing couples morbidly entangled in coitus, as in Couple 1, 1996, are an exorcism. But where Picasso sadistically attacked the other, namely women, as the works of his surrealist period from 1925 to 32 show, Bourgeois, a woman, masochistically attacks herself, more pointedly her body, and even more pointedly her skin, as the torn fabric of La Noce, a 2001 piece, shows. She may sew the tissues of her skin together, as in the upside down head of Eysenck, work from 2007, but the cuts remain conspicuous, scars left from self-destruction, the self-wounding. The upside down head suggests the old trope of the world turned upside down, that has gone mad, but for Bourgeois, the self has turned upside down, that is gone mad. The ego is first and foremost a bodily ego, Freud wrote, adding that it is not merely a surface entity, but is itself the projection of a surface, and quote from Freud, that is the skin, as he said, and as the psychoanalyst Didier Anzu emphasized in his discussion of what psychoanalysts call the skin ego, the container of the body ego. Such works as Maison Fragile, 1978 piece, in which Bourgeois reduces the female body to simplistic invisibility and strips the skin away totally. It's a minimalist structure of black sticks, a shell containing nothing, emptied of any signs of self, a devitalized abstraction of a figure, a body stripped of breasts and curves and any other features conventionally associated with a female body, a hollow woman, a geometric form suggestive of an anorexic body, certainly a body unrecognizable as organic or human, a body that is an empty house, a body housing no soul, suggests strongly that Bourgeois has a severely disturbed body image. La Noce confirms her disgust with her body, more broadly her self-disgust. Clearly, Bourgeois has difficulty containing herself, having a skin that contains her, let alone knowing who she is. Sometimes she is the she-fox, a 1985 work. Sometimes she is a lioness, as in Nature Study, 1984 to 2002. Sometimes she castrates men, as in the famous Fillet, Sweet Aversion, 1968-99, 99, excuse me, suggests taking possession of a penis as though in penis envy, more generally appropriating the phallus that is the symbol of their power. Sometimes she is just a hysteric, as in Arc of Hysteria, famous work, 1993, suggests, all of which suggests that her self is in perpetual crisis, each transformation holding off a breakdown. And breakdown she does twice in her life, once in 1932, when her mother Josephine died and she attempted suicide. She tried to drown herself. And again in 1951, when her father Louis died, and once again saw no reason to live, remarking that, I quote Louise, her life was beyond hope of repair, close quote. Her husband, Robert Goldwater, the prominent art historian, died in 1973, compounding her losses, all profoundly personal, for they were what psychoanalysts call primary objects, certainly significant others. It is worth noting that Louise never thought of herself as a surrealist, as she's been called, or a neo-primitivist, as she has also been called, but rather a symbolist, as she said to me, citing Goldwater's book on symbolism and denying that his equally influential book on primitivism was relevant to her art. All of these deaths shook her sense of identity, undermined her sense of self, and she blamed herself for them, unconsciously and not so unconsciously, for she acknowledges her envy of them, and with that, her wish to kill them, especially Goldwater, her husband, her rival, as she said, that's her word, and her father, as the destruction of the father, a famous 1974 work makes clear. More generally, she acknowledged her persistent antagonism, the title of a work she made from 1946-48, and what she called her aggressive pulsions, close quote. Born in 1911, excuse me, she was 21 at the time of her mother's death and had just begun to study calculus and geometry at the Sorbonne. And she's French, as you know. In response to the depression induced by her mother's death and to stave off its disintegrating effect, she stopped studying mathematics and began to study art, a life as well as mind-changing event, a turn away from objectivity towards subjectivity. In response to the death of her father, she was 40 at the time of the so-called midlife crisis, when one finds oneself halfway along our life's path, as Dante realized when he found himself lost in depressively dark woods facing the gate of hell with its inscription, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." And she, in fact, abandoned all hope at that time. She became deeply depressed, hopeless, so much so that she seemed to have suffered a psychotic break, as her numerous notes about the feeling she had at the time strongly suggest. In response to this psychotic depression, a suicide in principle, if not in physical practice, she began therapy with Dr. Leonard Kemner and eventually psychoanalysis with Dr. Henry Lowenfeld, a very prominent Freudian psychoanalyst, came from Berlin to New York and was affiliated with the Psychoanalytic Institute, the New York Psychoanalytic Institute, which is the first psychoanalytic institute ever in the United States. This analysis lasted 15 years from 1952 to 1967. She saw him often 5 times a week, and she continued to see him. He was always there when she needed him until his death in 1985. There has been a book written about him, his move from Berlin to New York. It was psychoanalysis, in my opinion, and in fact, not art, that guaranteed Bourgeois sanity, that permitted her to function as an artist, gave her the ego strength to be continuously creative, even when suffering from insomnia, as she did, a symptom of death anxiety, Todesangst, that is, as long as one was awake and could be creative during the night, one would not die in one's sleep. That's the fantasy. Bourgeois' insomnia drawings are a testimony to her will to live, and psychoanalysis gave her the strength to do so by giving her the sense of self she lost when her mother and father died. They are our primary self-objects, as the psychoanalyst Heinz called them, reminding us that there is no self or subject without an object or other. That is, we identify with others to become ourselves. The self is bipolar, as Kohut convincingly argues. He's the leading so-called self-psychologist, self-psychoanalyst. And without their empathy, one cannot endure and flourish. No person, favorite quote of mine, no person can survive, I'm quoting, psychologically in a psychological milieu that does not respond empathically to her, then she can survive physically in an atmosphere that contains no oxygen, Kohut famously argues. Perhaps Bourgeois felt that her mother and father were not especially empathic, suggesting why she thought little of herself, especially of her body. It may be one of the reasons she thought of herself as a monster, a predatory spider, to refer to a 1977 work, weaving a web to trap others, to catch them or embalm them, or like a cannibal, consume them, getting from their bodies the emotional nourishment she did not get from their souls. Also, standard psychoanalytic symbol interpretation, the spider is a symbol of the mother, and she was closely identified with the mother. And it's, of course, connected with the fact that her family was in the weaving business as well, weaving textiles. Lacking empathy, one responds with narcissistic rage, as Code says. It's the rage that informs Bourgeois' envy of her mother and father, indeed of anyone and everyone, from Louise Nevelson, whom she felt sold her ideas, to her mother, whom she thought was more, quote, competent than her, to Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko, who, like her father, were, as she says, I'm quoting her, charmers and fakes, which is why they got further in the art world than she did. Man or woman, competitor or confidant, she felt that Lowenfeld was smarter than she was and envied him his knowledge of psychoanalysis, which he had studied, at one time thinking of becoming a therapist, and acknowledged, responding to him as aggressively as she responded to her husband. One fell victim to her envy and rage. She notes her father's fits of rage, she clearly identifies with him, and envies his intimate sexual relationship with her English tutor, the mistress she clearly wanted to replace and envied. The malice evident in many of her work is reified rage, but then the atmosphere in her family home must have been empathic enough to creatively breathe. Quoting the psychologist Hans Eysenck, psychoticism is a personality pattern typified by aggressiveness and interpersonal hostility, adding, he adds, linked to increased vulnerability to psychosis, close quote. Bourgeois' psychotic episodes, so to speak, suggests that she was a psychotic personality, losing touch with external reality. And psychoanalysis enabled her to control or manage her psychotic tendencies and to artistically act them out, mastering them by aesthetically encoding them, more broadly expressing them, expression is representation, and thereby exorcising or purging them, as I suggested, and perhaps more pointedly, getting the empathic attention of others, spectators, of strangers who made her feel less estranged from herself by appreciating it. If we identify with the dead and blame ourselves for their death, that is, feel guilt as though we killed them, and thus want to kill ourselves or die with them, as some psychoanalysts think, then Bourgeois suffered excruciating guilt at the death of her parents, certainly a traumatic event. And if guilt is an aggression against oneself, and Bourgeois' primary problem was her aggression, as Lowenfeld thought, and she acknowledged, it was responsible for what she called, and I'm quoting her now, her self-defeatism, her insecurity complex, and her sense that she was, again quoting, nothing since you are only a woman and want to be a man, for having a penis is rewarded by both pleasure and standing, close quote. Then her depression at her parents' death was a kind of masochism, the self-torture that inaugurates self-destruction. Using Freud's distinction between mourning and melancholy to refer to that important work, Bourgeois could not successfully mourn her parents' death, finally separating from them and accepting their loss because of, I quote Freud, her delusional expectation of punishment, bringing with it, all Freud, a painful lowering of self-regard, a self-reproach representing unconscious hostility toward the lost object, which has been shifted onto the survivor's ego through the process of identification, close quote. If depression hints at death, then Bourgeois' depression was a suicidal death wish. It is on record that she thought of suicide, as previously noted, and attempted it, as well as a murderous death wish. Certainly, Bourgeois' art is fraught with self-torment and self-contempt, as well as, less convincingly to me, self-love. Broadly speaking, Bourgeois seems to have used her art to rescue herself from suffering, particularly the emotional unhappiness her body seemed to have caused her, more generally, the contempt she felt for herself because she was a woman, in part an internalization of the unconscious contempt many misogynist men feel for women, having in part to do with their difficulty in separating from or disidentifying with their mother, the first object we all identify with, by externalizing it in whatever distorted forms, distortion being a form of defense as well as exaggeration. As Bourgeois wrote to me, a very important quote, organizing a sculpture is like a treatment for the sick. So working on the work was clearly, on art, was therapeutic for her sickness. This suggests that her works have much in common or a convincing affinity with the art of the insane, so celebrated and emulated by many modern artists since 1922, when it became visible in the German art of the insane. Keeping a record of her feelings throughout her life, she notes, and I'm quoting her recurrent anxiety attacks, her violence unconscious, her fear of violent parental intercourse, the so-called terror of the primal scene, as the analysts call it, her feeling of being at the mercy, at the bottom of the well, her wish to, fabulous quote, to eat, to kill, to devour, to come, to kill the mother, to incorporate the father, to take his strength, and to be killed as a punishment, all testimony to her regression, kept her sane enough to make paradoxically meaningful art, that is, to be idiosyncratically creative enough to convey her feelings in socially convincing art. Art is a guarantee of sanity, she famously declared, but less well known is her idea of what it means to be sane. On August 27th, 1984, she wrote as follows, "To be an artist is a guarantee to your fellow human that the wear and tear of living will not let you become a murderer," close quote. That is, to murder other people, to murder the spectator. Finally, I would like to suggest that for Bourgeois, art serves to perform what the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion calls the alpha function. It's her containing function. Distinguishing between, and I'm going to quote Bion throughout this last discussion, distinguishing between raw, concrete, felt experiences which can only be dealt with by expulsion. He calls these the beta elements. And on the contrary, alpha elements, which lend themselves to storage in memory, understanding, symbolization, and further development. Bion argues the mother's capacity to bear anxiety projected into her by the infant transformed the beta elements into alpha elements. The bad feelings are projected into the mother's good breast by the nursing infant, which contains them in the act of nourishing the infant. The so-called container breast is an alembic in which the lead of deadly incomprehensible feelings, sensations, is transformed into the gold of comprehensible living thought. If the interchange between the infant and the breast is good, then the infant not only reintrojects its own projections made the more bearable, but she also introjects the container breast, and its capacity to perform the alpha function. An identification with a good container capable of performing the alpha function is the basis of a healthy mental apparatus. That is, one can withstand and process anxiety, and with that, understand and control feelings. I think that all her artistic life, Bourgeois struggled to become a good breast, as The Feeding, a 2007 work, suggests, and to be a good, nourishing mother, as The Good Father, a 2007 work, suggests, and Mammon, a 2008 work, suggests, and to have a good marriage and good family, as The Family, a 2008 work, suggests. And she said to me that she always felt she was a bad mother. All looks rosy, not to say intensely libidinous, but the hard breasts, dare one say hard-hearted, they certainly don't look as if they have the milk of human kindness. In Le Traîner Episode, a 1970 work, they certainly don't look blushly soft, gushing with love, but it is all rather childish, a game played with dolls, as The Reticent Child, 2003, makes clear, another self-portrait. I suggest that Bourgeois is an art made by a child, in her childish frame of mind, so to say, as her breastwork strongly suggests. Her art reminds me of Baudelaire's famous remark that genius is nothing more nor less than childhood recovered at will, close quote, and also of Freud's equally important remark that all mental illness is regression to childhood. We see the giant looming breast gloriously in our face, but also threatening us, almost overwhelming us in the images I've shown you. Its insistent, intimidating presence arousing anxiety as much as love, demanding that we pay homage to it, worship it, even as it rolls over us like a juggernaut. It is a child's monstrous vision of a breast, the breast that Philip Roth perversely metamorphosed into by enviously identifying with it in one of his stories. It certainly doesn't look like it contains our hopeless feelings. One can't help wonder, but if it's giving us blood, notice it's all red, as the hellishly red stream that flows from it suggests, rather than milk as bright as heavenly light. And nowhere does white milk flow from any of her breasts. Are we sucking its lifeblood like little vampires, or are we being given a blood transfusion to save us from some sickness-threatening death? We certainly look pitifully small and vulnerable, pathetic, trivial creatures unsure of our lives. The child, the infant that's there. Comparing Bourgeois' soft and hard breasts, the many breasts in Mammals, a 1991 work, and the many breasts of her Spiral Woman, 1984. They're both versions of the so-called Magna Mater, traced back to antiquity, the Great Mother. It seems clear that Bourgeois is profoundly ambivalent about being a woman and more broadly, a so-called borderline personality, oscillating between the extremes, unable to convincingly integrate them. A breast is what psychoanalysts called a part object. There are not many whole objects in Bourgeois' art, and those that are see make-believe dolls. Analysts think you see part objects may focus on a breast or a penis as an infantile attitude before you can see the whole object to see that it's all part of the same body. And we know that apparently infants, only by the age of 1, begin to realize that their legs, their arms, etc., are all part of the same body. A breast, as I say, is what is called a part object. There are not many whole objects in Bourgeois' art, and those that are seem like make-believe artificial dolls. In 2 untitled sculptures, one from 1953, the other from 1954, she piles part object on part object to make a haphazard body, a totemic figure with no identity and individuality. Her bloody red large breasts are rendered in what the psychoanalyst art therapist Rita Simon calls, I quote, the archaic massive style in which large scale and vibrant color give an effect of convexity and weight to simple forms, close quote. Bourgeois' fulsome breast is conspicuously curved, heavy, simplified, curved, heavy, simplified form, emblematic, as Simon says, of, quote her, emotional reality. The solidity of Bourgeois' sculptured breast conveys a sense of concentrated energy, Simon's term, another feature of the archaic massive style. The vitality of color, I'm quoting Simon, Bourgeois' red, gives an effect of massive form, the massive form of the breast pressing beyond its outlines. Continuing the quote from Simon, very important quote, in my opinion, expressionism is a recent version of archaic massive art, Simon writes, suggesting that Bourgeois' images of the breast are expressionistic. And I think her art is fundamentally a kind of expressionism, ambiguously abstract and representational, a point she made clearly, Bourgeois made clearly at the beginning of her career with her Saint Sebastian, 1947, implicitly the bleeding red heart in the breast of a man who gave his life to Christ, just as Bourgeois gave her life to art, reminding us that she said art is her religion. And of course, Saint Sebastian had arrows struck in him. Thank you.